Hello again, U.S. history students. It's good to see you all again. I hope you're doing really well. This is actually going to be our second installment of our study of the Gilded Age. And so we're going to be looking today at Gilded Age politics and some of the things that affected change and some of the things that eventually will lead to progressivism. So let's go ahead and get started. So hope you are having a good one. Okay, Baker's Corner, by the way. So last time, guys, for our introduction to the urbanization side of this, we really broke down the basic definition of the Gilded Age. And so I want to come back to that for a moment and just give you all some good, solid review. And that is, who was the person that's given the most credit for coining it? It is going to be Mark Twain, the famous author. He's going to make the argument that there are things that made the time period what he called gilded. Now, guys, if you look up the definition of gilded, and you're welcome to do that if you want, if you have Google available or whatever, the idea of gilded is that it's something of a glittering of gold that actually covers up something that's kind of either old or it's not exactly the most nice looking thing or whatever. Okay. And so in this time period, we're noticing economic prosperity for some, but not for everybody. Okay. So that's going to be the gilded. All right, we've got American industry booming. By 1900, America is leading all world countries in production and all those things. Okay, but the government corruption, which we'll look at more today in a second, and also a lot of the social urban issues from last time are the things that are basically not exactly going well for the United States. And so he and another author, but the one that gets the most attention is Twain, is obviously going to be pointing out that, you know what, we are really missing the mark of this time period if we don't try to go about in kind of like making known the problems of society. Okay. So just something to keep in the back of our minds. Okay. So politically, guys, remember the federal government is definitely more laissez-faire. Okay. So hands off. There's a little bit of an exception to this if you're looking at acts like the Interstate Commerce Act and the Sherman Antitrust Act, a few other very small scale things, but for the most part, they are not really getting heavily involved, right? So they're not regulating the economy as much as people want them to. Guys, remember the populist movement, right, that pops up because of, you got it, the railroad here, right, is going to be something that is important, right? So this laissez-faire economic policy that defines the time period quite a bit is going to be something that a lot of people in the future, particularly progressives, are like, well, you know what, there's a lot of problems when government is hands off. They're not regulating as much. And what's going to happen? You guessed it. You're going to have certain people that think that government needs to be more involved. Okay. So some people would say that the populists are kind of like a prelude to that, which there's some truth to that. But the progressives are going to be able to take that a step further because they did elect presidents and they did, of course, elect a lot of people in Congress. So therefore, they're going to have a pretty big impact. I would argue you're not going to see a significant jump in that until the early 1900s, but that's a story for next time. Okay. Corruption. We're not going to say a lot about this other than corruption has a lot of different, shall we say, parts to it. Credit Mobilier is going to be a famous scandal that dealt with the railroad. Government was getting subsidies to build it. They basically had this company, Credit Mobilier, that you had some politicians actually in the Congress and other parts of the Grant administration that were actually getting their pockets filled with money as a result of this. There's a little more to it if you want to research it. Okay. Whiskey ring, similar kind of thing when you're looking at taxation on whiskey. And then even the Belknap affair, which for those of you guys that remember our lesson on westward expansion was some of the downsides of the Native American treatment. This is obviously another example there. Okay. Now, something that we need to keep in mind is that most of these scandals are going to happen under the administration of, you guessed it, Ulysses S. Grant. Right, the famous U.S. history Civil War hero. Okay, there's a lot of debate. How much accountability does a person get if he's not directly implicated to them? Meaning that, to my knowledge, Grant doesn't say do this, do that, but they did happen under his watch. All right. So it's something for y'all to think about, but this sets the tone, guys, for people to be like, you know what? Politics shouldn't be like this, right? It should be the public good, the public interest that drives political decision making, not these affairs. Okay. And so those are all, the previous slide were all at the federal level. This one, however, is more local. Okay. So this is actually something we're going to spend a few minutes on, guys. So it might be worth taking a pause, write this down, and then going forward with the description. Okay. But the rise of what we call local political machines. Okay. So you've got these local party bosses. All right. The most famous one, as you can see on the slide, was a gentleman known as Boss Tweed. That's actually his nickname. His actual full name was William Marcy Tweed. Okay. And he's going to lead the Tweed Ring in Tammany Hall, which is in New York. Okay. And so what these political machines would do is that they would basically hand out favors a lot of times to the local people, immigrants, trying to people that supported their policies in office, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. They would do what was called, giving away money, almost like bribing people. There's a word that they have for that. It's called graft. Okay. And there's a big problem here, guys. And the problem is that a lot of times local law enforcement got to be pretty corrupt at the same time. Okay. For those of you that are either old enough to remember this, or if you're younger but you still like the show, a good example of this, just to use a quick modern example or pop culture example, is the Dukes of Hazzard, right? When you're looking at like Boss Hogg, his brother-in-law is Roscoe P. Crotrain, right? So he's the sheriff, and they're always trying to get one local community in trouble because it's supposed to be a dry county, and here it is, they're actually doing shady activities themselves. Okay, so what happens? Well, the Tweed Ring is operating in a way that's illegal. The problem is that Tweed has a lot of political power. He has a lot of power over the people, a lot of power over the local community. Finally, one day, a gentleman by the name of Thomas Nast, there's his picture right there. Okay. He's a cartoonist. One of the best reformers of his day, in my view. And yes, guys, those of you that actually like to draw, depending on how you do it, he did it in a very creative way. We'll look at a couple of examples in a second. There's one above him. Okay. But guys, his work is going to be extremely influential. He was actually, I want to say, a German immigrant. So he came over to the United States, was not what you would call a stellar student as far as academic subjects, but he loved to draw. And so Thomas Nast basically saw what was happening with Boss Tweed, and he's like, okay, you know what? I'm going to use the power of the pen, but I'm not going to do it in the form of writing as much. I'm going to do it in the form of drawing. And so he did. Okay. So guys, he starts to depict all these different things about Boss Tweed. This one right here, Boss Tweed, I think was kind of a big guy, but I don't think he was quite that large in size. Okay. But you can see like the money, there's definitely symbolism there with, him using local funds to actually kind of almost like pay people off. And Thomas Nast became a really strong advocate of local and also eventually national political reform. All right. So if you take a look here, guys, one of his most famous works about the Tweed Ring, these are actually two of them, by the way. This one right here on the left, you can see my cursor, is going to be Boss Tweed, not as, the guy with the money on his face. But guys, do y'all catch what the actual visual of him is? It's a vulture or a buzzard, right? So he's not depicting him in a positive way. This is definitely Nast being like, okay, this guy's corrupt. He's preying on the dead, which, really wasn't always truly accurate. But, that's important to keep in mind. This one over here, if you've ever heard of stuffing the ballot box, all right, you can see the ballot right here. The county there is strength. You'll notice Thomas Nast's signature here. Okay. And so what a lot of these local bosses were doing is that they were basically trying to keep certain people in office. So they were literally stuffing the ballot box. All right. Guys, you hear stories about this, like people that had been dead for years and years and years that were buried literally in local cemeteries and things like that, that actually they are showing up voting. Okay. And so that's obviously very corruptive. Okay. And the thing that's interesting, guys, with Thomas Nast is that Nast starts producing these cartoons. Well, Tweed finds out about it. Okay. And so Tweed, being a local boss, is like, at first he's like, well, most of the cities, like I think New York was like 80% immigrant or something like that. Chicago, same thing. Boston, larger cities as well. Philadelphia as well. So, guys, he makes a comment. I won't repeat exactly what he said, but he said, it's okay because the immigrants, they don't know English as their first language, and they can't read those stinking cartoons. Okay. However, they can visualize what's going on. And so what does he do? So he kind of reaches out to Thomas Nast and he says, okay, Nast, $500,000, it's yours if you basically stop doing your cartoons. And Thomas Nast is like a moral man in this respect. And he's like, nope, you're corrupt. You're taking advantage of the public. Therefore, I'm going to continue to do that. And so, guys, literally, Nast then puts, kind of like bounties, you could say, on the life of Thomas Nast, or Tweed does, excuse me. Nast, to my knowledge, guys, never backed down. Never backed down. And eventually, the Tweed ring is going to be implicated with these kinds of activities. And there's eventually going to be trials, and they're eventually brought down. Okay. So I like Nast a lot. There's another part, guys, of his signature with the other cartoon. But I like him a lot because I do think he's a reformer. I think he's an urban reformer. And I also think he's a reformer in general that uses his talents for good. Now, a couple of fun pictures here. A lot of you guys are wondering, okay, Mr. Baker, the town hall stuff, or the Tammany Hall stuff is interesting. Is there anything else about him that's kind of fun? The answer is yeah. He's not the one that, to my knowledge, came up with the donkey image for the Democratic Party. That actually kind of goes back to the time period of Andrew Jackson. But I want to say, guys, he's the one that really kind of went with it when it came to the idea of putting it on the front of his magazine he worked for, Harper's Weekly. And then I like to put this in here so that those of you that also are familiar with the Republican elephant, you'll notice he also did that as well. So he was very talented, right? And then another thing for those of us guys that like pop culture is the image that a lot of us think of with St. Nicholas or Santa Claus. There's a lot of them out there. If you want to Google them, you can do that. But anyway, and you'll notice again, pretty cool stuff here, right? One downside is that evidently, guys, Nast was not really good at managing his money. So he had a lot of economic problems. And I think it was Theodore Roosevelt, future progressive president, who really appreciated reformers. Actually, I think hired Nast as, I want to say it was like kind of like an ambassador position or something like it. I think it was Ecuador, if I'm not mistaken. And I want to say he died in like 1902. Okay. But I would argue, guys, you can't really talk about Gilded Age and progressive era reform unless you talk about Thomas Nast. All right. So he was really big. Okay. All right. So what do we notice, guys, politically during this time period? Here's another slide that might be worth stopping. We notice that the same two political parties still exist, but their blocks are being defined a certain way. Now, think about what a block might be. When I think of a block, I think of a group of things together. Okay. And so in this case, guys, the block is going to be groups of people that support the cause of either party. Okay. And so with Democrats, you're going to see in this time period, guys, keep in mind it changes over time. Okay, so you will see some variation here as time moves on. Keep in mind, a lot of your Democrats are going to revert back to the South. Okay, some in the North too. A lot of them are going to be in the South, so a lot of them are going to be white Southerners, kind of holding on to the idea of white supremacy and some of the old South mentality. Not all of them, but certainly a good number of them in the South. Catholics, recent immigrants, a lot of Jewish people are going to be Democratic in their party affiliation. Urban working poor, pro-labor. Okay, guys, every so often you'll hear people talk about like the Democratic Party is the party of the working class. Okay, again, there's debate on that, but a lot of times you'll hear that kind of brought up. And so that kind of supports that way back when. And then also mostly farmers. Okay. Republicans, northern whites, pro-business, makes a lot of sense. All right, where a lot of the industry is still very much concentrated in the north. African Americans, guys, remember that is a big, big thing that if you go back to our study of Reconstruction, right, you have a lot of focus on radical Republicans trying to draw in African American support. Okay, why? Because they want to be able to build Republican parties in the South, and that's a good way to do it, given that you have a sizable portion of the Southern population that are actually African American. Okay. Northern Protestants, there is a religious connection there. Old WASPs, which stands for White Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So again, that has an ethnic and also a religious side to it. And then also most of the middle class. Okay. So I think, guys, what we need to take from this slide, just real quick, is the idea that each party is going to have certain people that identify better with supporting them. And here's the weird thing, guys. Even though you have corruption during the Gilded Age, you have a lot of campaign issues. We'll look at that more in a second briefly. Okay, voter turnout. If you take a look, guys, at the evidence with voter percentages and things, voter turnout for eligible voters in this time period was actually pretty strong. I want to say it was in the 70s, 80% sometimes. Okay, today, in a general election, especially one that's the presidential one, you're doing really, really well if you have maybe 60 to 65% of eligible voters that actually vote, right? In a midterm election, which is every 2 years, keep in mind, so it's the one after the presidential one every 2 years, you're probably lucky if you get maybe 50%. Okay, but anyway, so people did go out and vote in larger numbers in this time period, even though there were some compromise with some of the political things going on. Okay. I don't know if you need to memorize every single one of these presidents. Historians a lot of times refer to them as the forgotten presidents because probably other than Grant, a lot of you might be like, who's that? Who's that? Who's that? Okay. One of which we're going to talk about more in a second. Okay. But one of them actually is the grandson, I believe it was, of William Henry Harrison. That's going to be Benjamin Harrison right there. You do have Grant, like I said. You have Rutherford B. Hayes. You're going to have a very short-lived president for reasons we'll talk about later in James A. Garfield, Chester A. Arthur. And then, guys, what do you notice about Grover Cleveland? This might win you Jeopardy one day. Yeah, Cleveland is the only president ever in American history to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. Okay. And he was also very, very big, from what I understand, about using presidential veto power. Okay. So anyway, something to keep in mind. Okay. So not a lot of issues actually divide the two parties early on. And then later on, you'll notice they start actually disagreeing on certain things. They do eventually compromise on things like the Sherman Antitrust Act. Okay. But the one thing I think we need to focus on, guys, the most is the idea, if you go back and you look at like the patronage system, excuse me, that by the way is not new. It's been around. If y'all remember the spoil system of Andrew Jackson. What's the problem with patronage? You're giving positions to loyal party members. All right. Which a lot of people are like, well, Mr. Baker, is that pretty common even before then? Yeah. Now, maybe it's not exactly used the same way that Jackson did with firing everybody that won't do everything you want them to do, but I would say it has been pretty common. Okay, so they're like, all right, this system needs to be reformed. There needs to be some parameters placed on positions that you hire people to that are not necessarily confirmed by the Congress. All right, because guys, remember, if you're appointing someone to, let's say, a cabinet position or something along those lines, okay, then they have to be confirmed by the Senate, right? But let's say that Mr. Baker is appointing a humongous group of government officials that are not having to be confirmed by the Senate. What's the big question mark, guys, with them being loyal? Are they also qualified? Okay. So some people pop up and they're like, okay, you know what? We need to make some headway here. All right. So eventually, guys, they passed what's called the Pendleton Civil Service Act. Now, one quick thing on this before we explain it. Every so often, you'll see this referred to as the Pendleton Act. It's the same exact act. Okay. And so what they said is they said, okay, so we're not going to be able to please everybody with the new policy, but we're going to try to at least do something of reform. Okay. So they're going to pass this act, which basically, guys, if you take a look here, says that for a pretty small percentage of government jobs, that you're going to have to take what's called an examination for a civil service job. All right. And the example I like to use, guys, with a lot of you, I know when I was a kid, almost always when you're a kid, getting mail is cool, right? Somebody sends you money, somebody sends you something. You're getting college acceptance letters if you're, obviously seniors or people like that. All right, you're probably not getting too many bills yet. That happens when you're older. Okay. But I remember, guys, when I was younger, I was like, man, that's so cool. I got a $5 check for my grandma or whatever. Okay. Well, guess what? You're like, Mr. Baker, what in the world does the Postal Service have to do with the examination system? A lot. All right. Because everybody that actually applies to be an employee of the Postal Service. Now, this is one example, but you can research more if you want to. Okay. They're going to have to take an examination system, right? So they're going to have to, figure out, okay, what do I need to study? What do I basically need to do to perform well? They take it. And of course, they get a score. Okay. And so what that score is supposed to do is it's supposed to show, are they qualified? All right. Now, keep in mind, guys, only a very small percentage at this point of time, especially, of government employees are actually going to go through this process. Okay. And a lot of you guys are wondering, okay, well, that should be a pretty simple thing. Why is it a big deal? The reason being is because you can make an argument that it leads to a presidential assassination. Okay. So the example I like to use, guys, is 1880. All right. So in the Republican Party, you've got division. All right. You've got what are called the half-breed Republicans. You have what are called stalwarts. Okay. The half-breeds, were a little bit more in favor of this system to reform civil service. Okay. Stalwarts, not so much. Okay. But they're of the same party. So they clash. Okay. So what happens? So they have a big meeting. James G. Blaine of Maine, so it rhymes, is a half-breed leader. Roscoe Conkling, both of them are senators, as you can see, of New York. And what do they have to do? They have to basically compromise. Who are we going to put on the ballot for the Republican Party? Because after all, they want to be able to keep the White House, right? They've had it, for a long time, with the exception of Johnson being a Democrat, right, since Lincoln. And so what do? They compromise. So the half-breed Garfield, that's his picture there, guys, became the presidential candidate, and Chester A. Arthur became the VP candidate. All right. And a lot of you guys are thinking, okay, Mr. Baker, how does this have anything to do with it? Well, both of them get elected. 1881 rolls around, March 4th. Garfield takes the oath of office in the same exact year. So he's not really in office a lot of time to do a whole lot. He basically gets assassinated by somebody who was a stalwart. Okay. And so this gentleman was like, or this guy was like, okay, now this half-breed has basically died. Now we have a stalwart in office. Rock on. That's not really what he said, but that's the nuts and bolts of it. The thing that's interesting, guys, is that the person who actually signed this Pendleton Civil Service Act into law is who? It's Arthur. Okay. So guys, he is actually going to follow through pretty well, I think, with a lot of that half-breed agenda. Okay. And this is a pretty tough situation. I mean, you've had Lincoln assassinated in 1865. You've got Garfield assassinated in 1881. You're eventually going to have another presidential assassination in 1901 with William McKinley. Okay. So within, about 36 years, you've got a lot of political unrest that's leading this. So here's my whole point, guys, with this slide. All right. Whether you remember all the facts on here is up to you. But this is a perfect illustration, guys, of how divisive this issue was within this party. All right. Because the stalwarts are like, no, we want to keep the same system in place. There should not be any restrictions to who we put in office or put into these positions. That act, even though it does a very small amount of reform, is a step in the right direction.